Hey kids! Over the next few weeks, you will be learning about what life was like in America hundreds of years ago. Hundreds of years ago, people made most of what they needed right at home. Living back then meant doing a lot of work, and even the children had to help by doing chores every day. Do you have any chores that you do at home, like help cooking, dinner, or taking care of pets? Over the next few days, you will be learning about towns, places where farmers could go to buy things that would make life easier at home. Where do you get your food and clothes? Well, hundreds of years ago, there were only a few kinds of stores called shops, and they were only found in towns, which could sometimes be very far from a farmer's house. A very large town might have several different shops, but most towns were small, often with only one shop. And this one shop carried just about every type of good a farmer could need: flour, cloth, seeds, tools, and so much more. Unlike today's stores, which you need money in order to buy something, during the colonial times way back then, the shops traded their goods for a farmer's crops, a practice called bartering. In towns, people lived and worked in buildings and shops that were super close together. In the country, homes and farms were far apart. So in this domain is called colonial towns and townspeople. In today's story, you're going to be able to identify the characteristics and differences between towns and the country. In today's story, called The Country Family, you are going to hear about different chores a family would have done hundreds of years ago on a farm. But first, let's go over our vocabulary. Our vocabulary word is country. A country is an area of land with few buildings, where homes are distant from one another, and most of the land is made up of farms. For example, the farmer and his family lived in the country. Let's start reading. Remember, this story is called The Country Family. Today, we're going to take an imaginary trip back in time, about 300 years ago, to an early American farm. If you lived in the country long ago, you and your family did most of the work necessary for survival right at home. The country is an area of land with few buildings and several farms. In the country, houses were far apart from one another, so you couldn't rely on neighbors or stores to get everything you needed. You had to make most things right at home. Everything you needed, food to eat, water to drink or use for cooking and cleaning, lighting to help you see after dark, heat when it turned cold, and clothing required a lot of work by the family. Even young children had to help out because there's so much work to do. There was no electricity for lamps or lights, and there were no flashlights. The only way to see anything after it got dark was to light candles that you made at home. There were no electric ovens or stoves like we have today, so you had to build a fire to heat your home and cook your meals. There were no sinks or faucets with running water inside the house, like we have in our kitchens and bathrooms. So you had to fetch any water you needed for drinking, cooking, and cleaning from the nearby creek or the well outside. There were no malls with clothing stores, so you had to make your own clothes. There were no supermarkets, so you had to grow your own vegetables, milk your own cows, and make your own cheese. Imagine doing all that work every day. At the start of a typical day in the country, the first thing a woman did was fetch wood to start the fire in the hearth, or fireplace. The hearth was the most important place in the home. Most of the chores had to be done required fire, and especially in the winter, everyone needed to stay close to the hearth because it provided the only heat in the house. After building the fire, a country woman would most likely start her day by baking bread. Sometimes she would make her own flour by grinding corn kernels or wheat into a fine powder. Then she would mix this flour and water with yeast and let it rise for several hours. The dough would then be put into an iron pot with a tight lid and hung over the hearth to bake or cook. One task that had to be done twice a day, no matter what, was milking the cows. This task took a long time and was usually left for children to do. Once the milk was collected, the milk that was not drunk was either made into cheese or butter. Making cheese involved the slow process of boiling and cooling the milk to produce curds or clumps of sourced milk that look sort of like cottage cheese. These curds were pressed into forms to make the cheese. To make butter, milk was left to sit until the fatty cream floated to the top. Then the cream was poured into a tall wooden container called a churn. Today we use the word churn to mean mix. A child usually had to pump the handle of the butter churn, called the dasher, up and down for a long time until the fat and the cream separated into butter. The leftover liquid called buttermilk was used for cooking or drinking. People in the country ate mostly vegetables and grains. They only ate meat if the men or nearby neighbors had butchered or killed for food one of their animals. Because there were no refrigerators, the meat had to be preserved so it would not spoil or go bad. This was done by hanging it in strips above the fire or in a separate shed like this one called a smokehouse. The smoke from the fire dried out the meat, which prevented spoiling. The fire kept the meat from going bad. Other foods were preserved by covering them in salt, canning them, or storing them in a cool, dark cellar. After all those chores were done, it was time for the sewing. In colonial times, women had to make their own thread and cloth before they could sew anything. Men in books picked cotton from the fields or sheared the sheep, or cut the wool off sheep, and women cleaned and dyed this cotton or wool. Then women made the cotton or wool into thread or yarn. After that, they would weave the yarn into cloth to be used for clothing. To weave means to join threads in an alternating pattern to make cloth. Girls were taught to sew and weave usually before the age of 10, so they could help make their own clothes. Because it was so much work to make clothes and so expensive to buy new clothes in town, much of the sewing work was patching or fixing old clothes that had become worn out and had holes or tears. Because children were expected to help out with every one of these chores, they did not have a lot of time to play. The few toys they had, they usually made themselves. Sometimes girls made dolls like these out of parts of a corn plant, and sometimes boys carved small toys out of wood. Most boys worked the farm alongside their fathers, taking over the family farm when they became older. If the family lived near a large town, some boys only lived at home until they were 11 or 12 years old. Then they were expected to learn a trade or a special job that uses certain skills. Each boy would become an apprentice for several years, working with a master tradesperson in town to learn his job. A tradesperson is an expert in his job or trade and is the one who trains an apprentice. The country family in colonial times worked hard every day. Sometimes a trip into town was a welcome relief or break from their daily tasks. In town, the family was able to trade or buy things they needed so they could save time and effort it took to make them. In the next story, you will hear about what happens when a farmer took a trip into town. The end. Now, let's have a discussion. So after I ask these questions, I want you to answer them with your family members. In colonial times, what kinds of chores did children who lived on a farm have to do? Was the farm we heard about in this story from a long time ago or one that exists today? How can you tell? Long ago, there was no electricity. What did farmers use for light to see at night? In your journal, write about if you think you would have liked to live on a farm in the country hundreds of years ago. Why or why not?